My sister once told our whole family, in front of everyone, that I had wasted 9 years of my life on a duplex, one nobody asked me to save. She said it lightly, the way she said most cruel things. Like it was a joke everyone should already be laughing at. 3 years later, during the worst ice storm our state had seen in a decade, a fire captain stood in my basement unit, radio crackling, and told a dispatcher that the only code-compliant shelter on the block belonged to me. My name is Thea Kettering. I am 41 years old, and I am a court reporter in Fargo, North Dakota. That job means I spend my working life writing down exactly what people say, word for word, adding nothing, and taking nothing away. That skill mattered more than anyone in my family expected, though not in the way you'd think. Let me take you back to where all of it actually started. Back to a kitchen table, and a woman named Sabina who taught me that quiet responsibility is still responsibility, even when nobody claps for it. Our grandmother, Sabina Kettering, bought the duplex on Birchwood Avenue in 1979. Back when Fargo was still mostly grain elevators and gravel lots. Back when a young widow buying property outright was the kind of thing people whispered about at church. She raised my mother in the upstairs unit and rented the downstairs to tenants, choosing each one with the seriousness of a woman selecting family. By the time I was born, Sabina was already old, already slower, but she was never careless. She walked me through that basement unit when I was 9 and showed me the breaker box, the water shutoff, and the brass tag on the furnace listing its last inspection date. She said a house takes care of the people who take care of it, and nothing else. I believed her, the way children believe grandmothers, completely and without question. My sister Blythe was 6 years older than me and had no patience for any of it. She used to sit on the porch steps, kicking her heels against the wood, while Sabina and I did our slow circuit of the property. She used to say, loud enough for us to hear, that old houses were a waste of a perfectly good Saturday. I remember one specific afternoon, when I was maybe 11 and Blythe was 17, that I think about more than almost any other memory from that house. Sabina had asked Blythe to watch the downstairs unit while a plumber replaced a leaking pipe, just to make sure he didn't need anything and to lock up once he finished. Blythe agreed, then left an hour later to meet friends at the mall, certain the plumber would lock up himself. He didn't. The unit sat unlocked overnight, in a neighborhood that wasn't dangerous exactly, but wasn't nothing either. Sabina found it the next morning, her heart in her throat, until she'd confirmed nothing had been taken. She never yelled at Blythe about it. She simply started asking me, from that day forward, to double-check things after Blythe had already said she'd handled them. I didn't understand, at 11, that I was being quietly promoted into a role my older sister had just as quietly vacated. I only understood, much later, how early that pattern had actually started. Blythe was never cruel to me as a child, not exactly. She was careless, which is a different thing, though it leaves marks just as deep if it goes on long enough. She'd borrow my things and lose them. She'd promise to pick me up and forget. She'd tell our mother she had handled something she hadn't touched at all. Our mother called it Blythe being Blythe, the way families do when a pattern gets treated as personality instead of something worth naming honestly. I grew up learning to expect less from her and to quietly do more myself, and I didn't think of that as a wound back then. I thought of it as simply how our family worked. Two sisters, one careful, one loose, and everyone content to let it stay that way. When Sabina died, I was 26 and Blythe was 32, and the will was almost insultingly simple. The duplex went to both of us equally on paper. In practice, from the very first week, it went to me. Blythe made that clear at the reading itself, folding the papers into her purse. She said she didn't have the time or the temperament for tenants and toilets, and that I could handle the boring parts since I apparently liked that kind of thing. I didn't correct her. I had just started my court reporting apprenticeship. My hours were flexible in the way only entry-level government work can be, and some stubborn part of me wanted to prove I could keep Sabina's promise, even if nobody else cared whether I did. So I became the one who called the plumber, the one who filed the permits, the one who sat in dusty city offices, renewing rental licenses, while Blythe, meanwhile, collected her half of the income, never once asking what any of it cost. For the next 15 years, that arrangement calcified into something nobody questioned out loud, though everyone in the family understood its shape well enough. I paid for the new furnace in 2014 out of my own savings because Blythe said she was stretched thin that year. I paid for the roof in 2018, mostly out of my own savings again, because Blythe was between jobs and didn't want to hear about it. I scheduled the annual fire alarm inspections myself. I kept a folder, physical and digital both, with every permit and every invoice and every signed inspection sheet, going back to the year Sabina died. My husband Anselm used to tease me about that folder. It was a thick blue 3-ring binder that lived on a shelf in our hall closet, tabbed and dated with the same precision I brought to my court transcripts. He called it my second job that didn't pay anything, and he wasn't entirely wrong. But he also understood, better than my own sister ever did, why I kept it anyway. Anselm and I met at a wedding, of all places, both of us seated at the awkward table, the one reserved for guests who barely knew the bride. He worked in agricultural equipment sales back then, and still does now. He told me later that what made him notice me that night wasn't anything I said. It was the way I'd quietly reorganized the seating cards when the caterer's system fell apart, without asking anyone's permission, and without expecting thanks for it. He said it was the first time he'd watched someone fix a problem simply because it needed fixing. I married a man who noticed that in me, and I think it mattered more than I realized at the time. It meant I had one person in my life who saw the binder the way Sabina would have seen it. Not as an eccentricity, but as a kind of quiet integrity. I fell into court reporting almost by accident. It's the way a lot of people fall into the career that ends up defining them. A guidance counselor in high school mentioned it once, offhand, as a field that rewarded people who could sit still and pay close attention. Something about that description lodged itself in my head and never quite left. I liked the discipline of it from the very first training course, the rule that you record exactly what was said. Not what you thought someone meant, not a cleaner version of a stumbled sentence, but the actual words, in the actual order, with every hesitation intact. My instructor used to say a court reporter's entire job was refusing to improve on the truth. I remember thinking, even then, that the sentence could have described Sabina just as easily as it described my chosen profession. I do not think my career and my binder are unrelated. I think they grew from the same root, a stubborn belief that the exact record of what actually happened matters more, in the end, than anyone's more convenient version of events. Blythe, meanwhile, bought her own rental property in 2016. A narrow two-story on the other side of town, paid for with money she'd inherited from our father's side. She added a chunk of the rental income she'd been collecting from Birchwood Avenue without ever contributing to its upkeep. She ran it the way she ran most things, fast and loose, confident that consequences were something that happened to other, less charming people. She skipped inspections when she could get away with it. She hired the cheapest contractor available for anything that broke. And when things broke again a year later, she called someone even cheaper still. I heard about most of this secondhand from our mother, who relayed it the way she relayed everything about Blythe, with a kind of proud, indulgent shrug, as though corner cutting were simply a flavor of confidence. Blythe's mockery was never limited to the binder alone, and I think it's worth saying that plainly. At a cookout 2 summers before that particular Thanksgiving, she introduced me to a new boyfriend of hers. She said I was the sister who typed other people's arguments for a living. It was delivered in a tone that made the whole table chuckle politely and made me feel, just for a moment, very small. I didn't correct the description, though it wasn't quite right. I remember driving home that night, wondering whether Blythe genuinely didn't understand what I did all day. Or whether she understood perfectly well and simply preferred the smaller version, the one that made her own choices look more interesting by comparison. I never landed on a satisfying answer to that question. Some questions about the people who raised you alongside you just stay open, I've learned, no matter how many years you spend turning them over. At Thanksgiving in 2021, both of our families crowded around my mother's table. Blythe brought up my binder like it was the funniest thing she'd thought of all year. She said I was the only person she knew who treated a rental duplex like a shrine, who filed permits the way other people said prayers, who had spent, by her estimate, 9 years of my one wild and precious life protecting a building that would have been fine either way. My mother laughed. My uncle laughed. Anselm did not laugh, and neither did I, though I let it pass, the way I let most things pass, filing it away instead of fighting about it. That instinct made me good at my job, and bad, according to Blythe, at standing up for myself. I've thought about that trade many times since, whether it was really a flaw or simply a different kind of strength, one that takes longer to prove itself. Sabina's funeral was small, held on a gray March morning at a church she'd attended for almost 50 years. Blythe gave the eulogy, and I remember it being genuinely good, warm and funny in the way Blythe could be, when she wasn't performing for a crowd that expected her to be careless. She talked about Sabina's stubbornness and her garden. She talked about the way Sabina made every visitor feel like the most important person in the room. She did not mention the duplex once, not even in passing, and I remember noticing that even then, though I didn't say anything. Afterward, at the small reception in the church basement, my mother pulled me aside and told me she was glad I was the responsible one, the way you'd thank a chair for holding your weight. I smiled and said it was fine. It took me years to admit, even to myself, that being called responsible in that particular tone was its own small kind of dismissal. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story. I did not spend those 15 years thinking about vindication. I did not maintain that binder because some part of me expected a day would come when it would matter to anyone but the city inspector who reviewed it once a year. I kept it because Sabina asked me to, in the last conversation we had before the stroke that took her. Some promises don't need an audience to still be worth keeping. That distinction matters, because what happened 3 years ago wasn't a plan finally paying off. It was an accident of timing, a storm that arrived on the worst possible night, and a version of the truth that had been sitting quietly on my closet shelf, waiting for someone to finally need it. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever been the one who did the unglamorous work while someone else took the credit, stay with me. The part of this story that changed everything is still coming. But first, I want to ask you something, since this channel exists because people like you keep showing up for stories like mine. Somewhere in your life, there is probably a person who does the quiet, unglamorous work that keeps something standing, a person nobody thanks properly. Tell me about them in the comments below. I read every single one, and I think they deserve to be named, even here, even by a stranger. The ice storm hit Fargo on a Tuesday in February, 3 years ago now. The kind of storm the meteorologists had been warning about for almost a week, without anyone quite believing them. Freezing rain fell for 6 straight hours. The temperature dropped hard enough, eventually, to turn every surface in the city into something closer to glass. Power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, one after another, in a slow rolling wave, moving through neighborhoods like a held breath finally released. By 8 that night, nearly 40,000 households across the city were without electricity. The temperature outside had fallen to 11 degrees and was still falling. Anselm and I sat in our living room with 2 flashlights and a battery radio, listening to the mayor's office announce warming centers. I remember feeling grateful, in a small, selfish way, that the duplex on Birchwood had a furnace I trusted. I was the one who had chosen it and maintained it, and had it serviced every single autumn without fail. Blythe's rental property, the narrow 2-story across town, had a furnace she had never once had serviced, not in the 7 years she'd owned it. Its carbon monoxide detector, her tenant later told investigators, had been chirping with a low battery warning for nearly 2 months by then. Her tenant was a quiet young man named Emeric Corvin, who worked nights at a distribution warehouse and mostly kept to himself. He had mentioned the chirping detector to Blythe twice, once by text and once in person, and both times she told him she would get to it. She had not gotten to it. When the power failed that Tuesday night, Emeric did what a lot of people without heat and without electricity do in a North Dakota winter. He brought a small propane heater in from his car and ran it in his closed, unventilated bedroom. It was the only heat source he had, and the detector that might have warned him was sitting dead and silent on his nightstand. I did not know any of this as it happened. I found out the way most people find out about emergencies involving people they love, sideways, through a phone call that didn't explain enough and asked for everything anyway. My mother called me at 9:40 that night, her voice tight and strange, and said Blythe needed me. There had been some kind of accident at her rental, she said. An ambulance was already there, and Blythe was standing outside in the freezing rain, unsure what else to do with her hands or her body. I asked her 3 times to just tell me what happened. I remember her finally saying the words carbon monoxide, and I remember the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather. Before we left the house, Anselm asked me, quietly, pulling on his boots by the door, whether I was sure I wanted to go straight there, instead of waiting for more information first. It was a fair question. Our relationship with Blythe, at that point, had been strained for years, in the low, simmering way sisters manage without ever formally declaring a conflict. He knew, better than anyone, how many times I'd absorbed her carelessness without complaint. I told him I didn't know yet what I wanted. I only knew my sister was standing outside in freezing rain. I couldn't sit in our warm living room, pretending that fact didn't matter to me. He nodded, and didn't ask again, and grabbed the extra blankets from the hall closet on his way out the door, without me having to ask him to. Anselm drove me across town on roads that had turned to sheet ice, going slower than either of us wanted. We were both silent, in that specific way people go silent when speed feels dangerous, and speed also feels like the only thing that matters. When we got there, the street was lit up with emergency vehicles, red and white light bouncing off every icy surface. Blythe was standing on the sidewalk in a coat that wasn't warm enough, watching paramedics wheel a stretcher toward an open ambulance door. Emerick was alive. He would stay alive, though the paramedics told us later it had been close. Close enough that another hour would likely have changed the outcome entirely. A neighbor walking her dog past the house, half blind in the freezing rain, had smelled something wrong through a cracked window and called it in. That neighbor's instinct was the only reason any of us were standing there instead of somewhere much worse. The fire captain on scene, a broad, tired-looking man named Dale Osgood, walked the property afterward with a flashlight and a clipboard. I watched Blythe's face as he read off the violations, one at a time, in a flat, professional voice. No functioning carbon monoxide detector. Improper venting on a supplemental heat source. A furnace with no service record he could find anywhere in the city's permit system, going back as far as the records existed. He asked Blythe when the property had last been inspected. She said something vague about the previous owner having handled all that before she bought it. Dale Osgood looked at her for a long moment and said, not unkindly, that the previous owner's inspections didn't transfer. This was now the third property fire-related incident he'd worked in that specific neighborhood in 2 years. That was when someone, I still don't know who, mentioned that Blythe's sister owned a similar duplex a few miles away. They asked whether that property had power, whether it had heat, whether there was any chance it could take displaced tenants for the night, given how many warming centers were already full past capacity. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through. The basement unit on Birchwood had been vacant for 3 weeks between tenants. It had heat and power that hadn't gone out, and it had a functioning smoke and carbon monoxide detector, one I'd personally installed and tested 6 weeks earlier during my routine autumn maintenance walkthrough. Within the hour, Emerick's neighbor from the upstairs unit, an elderly woman named Millicent with nowhere else warm to go, was sitting on my grandmother's old sofa in that basement unit. She was wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea Anselm had made her, while I stood in the doorway, trying to process how quickly an ordinary Tuesday had turned into this. Millicent stayed with us for 2 nights, until her son could drive in from Bismarck once the roads cleared. She was quiet at first and shaken, apologizing constantly for the intrusion. It took most of that first evening before she'd even accept a second blanket without protesting that she was fine. By the second night, though, she'd relaxed enough to tell me stories about the neighborhood from decades earlier. About the bakery that used to sit on the corner before it became a laundromat, about a version of Birchwood Avenue that existed before either Blythe or I had been born. I remember thinking, somewhere in that conversation, that this was exactly the kind of small, ordinary kindness Sabina would have wanted that basement unit to hold. And it had held it because someone had bothered, year after year, to keep it in working order, long before anyone needed it to. Blythe's husband, a quiet man named Garrick who mostly stayed out of family disputes, called me 2 days after the incident, before the group chat message, before any of what came next. He said he wanted to thank me for taking Millicent in, and then, after a pause, he said something I didn't expect. He said Blythe had been up most of that first night, not talking, just sitting at their kitchen table staring at nothing, and that he'd never seen her that shaken by anything before. I told him I appreciated the call. I didn't tell him that some part of me was glad she was shaken, because a small, unkind part of me thought she should be. I'm not proud of that thought, but I promised myself, when I started telling this story, that I would tell it honestly. That was the truth of where I was that week. Dale Osgood came by the next morning to do a follow-up walkthrough of my unit, mostly as a formality. Word had traveled through the department that this was the sister property involved in the incident. I remember him standing in my basement, running his flashlight along the furnace, checking the tag with the inspection date I'd had serviced that October. He asked, almost offhand, whether I had a maintenance record he could look at for his report. I pulled the blue binder down from the hall closet shelf and handed it to him. I watched him go quiet as he flipped through page after page, 15 years of invoices and permits and signed inspection sheets, organized by year, tabbed by system. He told me it was more complete than anything he usually saw from private landlords, let alone ones managing a single small duplex without any property management company behind them. He asked, again almost offhand, whether the other property, Blythe's property, had been managed by the same person. I told him no, that my sister managed her own rental independently, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Some professional recognition clicking into place. It's the kind of thing a person learns to read without being told directly, after walking hundreds of properties over a long career. He didn't say anything critical about Blythe in that moment. He was careful, professional, the way people in his position generally are. But he did ask if he could photocopy a few pages from my binder for his own reference file. He said something about wanting a clean example of what compliant maintenance documentation looked like. He apparently didn't come across it often enough to have a good sample on hand. The story could have ended there, quietly, the way most true stories about diligence and unglamorous work usually do end. Without an audience, without a reckoning, just one woman's binder photocopied into a fire captain's reference file, and nothing more said about it. But 2 days later, once the roads had cleared and the power had come back on across most of the city, my mother hosted what she called a check-in dinner. The kind of gathering families do after something frightening has passed, when everyone needs to sit in a room together, and confirm out loud that everyone is still alive. Blythe came. Emmerich, thankfully released from the hospital that same afternoon, did not come, understandably wanting nothing more to do with any of us that particular week. And somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, my mother's phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat, the one with 22 relatives in it. The one Blythe had apparently opened that morning, typing a long message into it without checking, correctly, who else was still sitting in that thread. The dinner itself started ordinarily enough, almost aggressively ordinarily, the way families sometimes overcorrect after a scare. My mother had made too much food, the way she always does when she's nervous, and for the first 20 minutes everyone talked about small, safe things. The storm damage to the Hendersons' oak tree 2 doors down, a cousin's upcoming wedding, whether the power company owed the whole city an apology for how slowly the repairs had gone. Blythe seemed subdued but not distressed, answering questions about Emmerich's condition in short, careful sentences. I remember thinking, for those first 20 minutes, that maybe this dinner would simply be what it claimed to be. A quiet confirmation that everyone had survived a bad week. If you're new to this channel, you already know something. A moment like this is usually where a story like mine turns. I promise you it does, but not yet, not quite in the way you might expect. Before I tell you exactly what Blythe wrote and what happened when my mother's phone lit up at that table, subscribe if you want to hear the rest. Hear how a 15-year-old binder, kept faithfully through every ordinary season, became the reason my sister finally had to sit across from a fire captain, a city inspector, and her own quiet, thoroughly documented sister. Hear her finally answer for something she had spent 2 decades treating as a joke. My mother's phone buzzed twice, then a third time, and she glanced down at it the way people glance at notifications during dinner. Half attention, mostly reflex. I watched her face change as she read it. I watched her set her fork down slowly, and I knew, before she said a word, that something had gone sideways. She turned the phone around and showed me the screen without comment, and there it was. It was a message Blythe had sent to the entire extended family group chat that morning, apparently venting to our aunt, in what she must have believed was a private side conversation. Except she had typed it directly into the main thread by mistake. The message said the fire department was being dramatic about a few missing paperwork technicalities. It said Emmerich was fine now, so the whole thing was basically over. She wished everyone would stop treating her like a criminal over a heater malfunction. Then, underneath that, a second message, clearly meant as a private aside to our aunt, but sent to all 22 of us instead. It said that at least this whole mess had finally shut Thea up about her precious binder for 5 minutes. Almost getting someone killed, apparently, was the only thing dramatic enough to compete with my filing system. I read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. Blythe hadn't apologized to anyone at that table. She hadn't apologized to Emmerich either, who was recovering at his mother's house across town, with a headache the doctors said might take weeks to clear. She had, instead, in a message she believed was private, minimized what happened to a paperwork technicality. And mocked me, in the same breath, for the exact habit that had put a warm, safe roof over a terrified elderly woman's head 2 nights earlier. I set the phone down and didn't say anything for a long moment. I noticed Anselm's hand find mine under the table, steady, the way it always is when he can feel me deciding how much of myself to spend on a fight. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once, in this entire story, raised my voice at my sister, and I'm not going to pretend I suddenly did, because that isn't what happened. This channel exists to tell the truth about how these things actually unfold. What I did instead was ask Blythe, calmly, in front of the whole table, whether she had scheduled a professional inspection of her furnace yet. The fire department's report would require documentation of corrective action, I told her, before she could legally re-rent that unit to anyone. She went very still. She said she was working on it. I asked whether she had a copy of the report Dale Osgood had filed, and she admitted she hadn't requested one yet. I told her, still calmly, that I had one, because I'd requested mine as a courtesy when he did the follow-up walkthrough of my own unit. I told her hers listed 6 separate violations, 3 of them classified as immediate safety hazards. The city's rental licensing office would very likely reach out to her directly within the week, I said, given how severe the report was. My mother asked how I knew all of that. I told her the truth, that Dale Osgood and I had spoken twice since the incident, once at my unit and once by phone, when he called to confirm a detail for his written report. He had mentioned, during that second call, that incidents involving a documented pattern of neglect sometimes triggered a broader licensing review, not just of the property where the incident occurred, but of a landlord's entire portfolio. Blythe's face went through several colors in quick succession. She said this was exactly the kind of thing I would bring up at a family dinner. Turning someone else's mistake into a performance, she called it. I told her I hadn't brought it up. She had, first in a message she thought was private, and now, again, by asking me a direct question at this table, in front of everyone, and not liking the honest answer she got back. My uncle, who had laughed loudest at that Thanksgiving joke 3 years earlier, said nothing at all this time. I noticed it, the way you notice silence from someone who once found your seriousness funny and now doesn't anymore. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way television makes these things look. There was no courtroom, no lawsuit, though Americ's family did consult an attorney about the medical bills. That conversation eventually resolved through Blythe's landlord insurance rather than through litigation, which I was quietly relieved about, for Americ's sake more than my sister's. What did happen was slower and, in its own way, harder for Blythe to sit with. The city's rental licensing office did open a review, exactly as Dale Osgood had predicted. That review required Blythe to bring her property up to full code compliance, at real cost, on a real timeline, with real inspections she could no longer skip or delay. She had to hire a licensed contractor to redo the furnace venting properly. She had to install detectors that met current code in every unit. She had to pay a reinstatement fee and sit through a mandatory landlord education course, the kind the city requires for any documented safety violation. Blythe asked me to come with her to the licensing review hearing, held in a small municipal conference room on a Thursday afternoon in March. I almost said no. It felt like the kind of request that could go badly either way, Either she'd resent me for witnessing it, or she'd lean on me in a way that let her avoid facing it herself. I went anyway and sat 2 rows back. I watched a city compliance officer named Ruth Ann Feld walk Blythe through 6 months of required corrective steps. Her voice stayed level, no matter how many times Blythe tried to explain the previous owner, the busy year, the tenant who should have said something sooner. Ruth Ann Feld did not raise her voice either. She simply read the code sections aloud, one at a time, and asked Blythe to confirm she understood each one. And Blythe confirmed over and over in a smaller voice each time. At the end, Ruth Ann Feld looked at Blythe and said the county saw incidents like this every winter. The ones that turned out worse than a scare, she said, almost always involved a landlord who'd been told, more than once, and hadn't listened. I watched Blythe absorb that sentence like a physical blow, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something closer to sadness for her than anger. After the hearing, Blythe and I sat in her car in the municipal lot for almost 20 minutes before either of us started the engine. She asked me, in a voice stripped of all her usual performance, whether I thought she was a bad person. I told her the truth. I didn't think she was a bad person, I said, but I thought she'd spent a very long time mistaking convenience for confidence, and those were not the same thing, no matter how similar they sometimes felt from the inside. She didn't argue with me. She just sat there, watching her breath fog the windshield, and eventually said she wished Sabina were still alive to tell her that herself, in the plain, unhurried way Sabina used to say hard things. I told her Sabina had already tried to teach both of us the same lesson, years ago, on that porch, with that binder. Maybe, I said, it had simply taken one of us longer to hear it than the other. She almost laughed at that, a small, surprised sound, and said that sounded exactly like something our grandmother would have pointed out, whether either of us wanted to hear it or not. I did not gloat through any of it, and I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to, and some petty, tired part of me occasionally wanted to. 15 years is a long time to be quietly dismissed for the same habit that eventually kept a stranger alive. There were nights that spring when I lay awake replaying that Thanksgiving dinner from years earlier. Blythe's laugh, my mother's laugh. The particular sting of being the joke at your own family's table, for caring too much about something that mattered. But gloating isn't repair, and repair was the only thing I actually wanted from any of this, if repair was even still possible between us at all. So when Blythe finally called me, almost 3 weeks after the incident, and asked, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from her in years, whether I would walk her through a real maintenance binder, I said yes. Not because the request erased anything. It didn't. But because Sabina had taught me a house takes care of the people who take care of it. Somewhere in that lesson was a second one I only fully understood at 41 years old. People can sometimes be taught the same thing, if you're patient enough and honest enough to teach it, without needing them to grovel first. That doesn't mean everything between Blythe and me went back to some easy, uncomplicated closeness. If you're expecting me to tell you we hug it out at every holiday now, I won't lie to you and pretend that's the story. It isn't. I still keep my binder. I still handle Birchwood Avenue the way I always have, because that arrangement never actually changed, only the respect underneath it did. Blythe still owns her own property outright, still runs it herself, but she calls me now, every autumn, to ask what she should be checking before the cold sets in. She has never again, not once in 3 years, made a joke about my folder at a family table. Emerick, for his part, moved to a different rental across town once he'd recovered. I think about him sometimes, a stranger whose name I only learned because my sister's negligence and my grandmother's discipline collided on the worst possible night. I hope, wherever he is now, that his new landlord keeps better records than the last one did. Millicent still sends me a Christmas card every year, a small, old-fashioned habit I've come to look forward to. Last winter's card included a photograph of her grandchildren standing in front of a decorated tree. A note thanked me for a warm couch on a cold night she said she'd never forget. I saw Emerick once more, about 4 months after the storm, entirely by accident at a hardware store where I'd gone to buy weather stripping. He recognized me before I recognized him. He thanked me again for the couch, the tea, and the 2 nights of warmth. His voice still carried a slight rasp, one the doctors said might never fully clear. I asked how he was doing, and he said better, mostly, though he still kept a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector on his nightstand out of habit, one he checked every single night before bed. I told him that sounded like a good habit to keep. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, and said his mother had told him the exact same thing, word for word, and that maybe careful people just recognized each other eventually. I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. Careful people recognizing each other. How much of my own life had quietly been shaped by looking for exactly that? The following winter, almost exactly 1 year after the storm, Blythe called me on a Tuesday evening, unprompted, just to tell me she'd had her furnace serviced early that year, before the cold really set in. The technician, she said, had complimented how clean her maintenance file already looked. She said it lightly, almost shy about it, the way you tell someone news you're not sure they'll actually care about. I told her I cared. I meant it more than the words probably conveyed over the phone. After we hung up, I sat for a while in my kitchen. I thought about how strange it is. The people who wound us most deeply are so often capable, given enough time, of becoming genuinely different people. Not perfect, not fully healed, just different in the one specific way that mattered most. There is one more small thing I want to tell you, because it's the detail I still think about most, more than the storm, more than the group chat, more than any of the paperwork that followed. A few months after everything settled, Blythe asked to see the binder itself. Not a photocopy, not a summary, the actual binder, the one Sabina's habits had shaped me into keeping. She sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, going through it page by page, asking real questions about permits and warranties and inspection cycles. Near the end, she found the very first entry, dated the month after Sabina died, my careful, uncertain 26-year-old handwriting recording a furnace tune-up I'd barely known how to schedule. She looked at it for a long time. Then she told me she was sorry. Sorry it took a stranger nearly dying for her to finally sit down and look. Before I tell you the last thing I want you to take from this, I want to say one more time why this channel exists. It exists because of people who show up and listen all the way to stories like this one. If a story like mine has made you think differently, even a little, about the quiet work someone in your own life does without recognition, subscribe. Stay a while, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you here. There are a few things I've come to believe, sitting with this story for 3 years now. I want to leave them with you the way Sabina once left her lessons with me. Plainly, without decoration. The first is this. Diligence rarely announces itself as valuable in the moment you're practicing it. Nobody claps when you renew a permit on time or schedule a furnace inspection nobody asked you to schedule. The value shows up later, sometimes years later, sometimes on a night you never could have predicted. If you are the person quietly doing that work right now, I want you to know it counts, even when the people closest to you can't yet see why. The second thing I believe is this. Being underestimated by your own family is one of the loneliest, strangest forms of dismissal there is, because it comes wrapped in love, or something close enough to love to confuse you. Blythe never hated me. She loved me in her own limited, careless way the entire time, and that made her mockery harder to metabolize, not easier. You can't simply write off a person's opinion when that person is also the one who taught you to ride a bike. If someone in your life loves you and still consistently underestimates the work you do, both things can be true at once. You are allowed to hold both without pretending the second one doesn't hurt you. The third thing, and maybe the one that matters most, is that vindication, when it finally comes, rarely feels like the victory you imagined it would feel like. I did not feel triumphant standing in that basement unit while Dale Osgood photocopied pages from my binder. I felt tired and a little sick because a young man had nearly died 2 miles away for want of the exact diligence I'd been mocked for practicing. Real vindication, the kind that actually means something, usually arrives dressed as relief that things weren't worse. Not as proof that you were right all along. If you can remember that distinction when your own moment comes, I think it will serve you better than mine served me in the first raw days after the storm. The fourth thing I want to leave you with is smaller, but it has stayed with me just as long. Repair does not require the person who hurt you to fully understand what they did, not at first. Blythe still doesn't fully understand, I think, why that group chat message cut as deep as it did. What she understands now is simpler, and maybe that's enough. She understands that the binder was never really about the binder. It was about being taken seriously by the person who was supposed to know her best, and she is finally, slowly, learning how to do that. And the last thing, the one I'll leave you with tonight, is that repair is possible even after real harm, but it has to be earned honestly, slowly, without shortcuts. The same way a binder gets built one invoice at a time, over 15 patient years. Blythe and I are not the sisters we might have been. Not if Sabina had lived longer. Not if the storm had never come. Not if a propane heater in a closed room hadn't nearly cost a stranger his life. But we are something steadier now than we were before. Built the same unglamorous way everything worth keeping gets built, one small responsible choice repeated quietly, long after anyone is watching to see if you'll keep making it. Last Thanksgiving, almost exactly 3 years after the joke that opened this whole story, we were back at my mother's table again. The same room, the same chairs, most of the same faces. Somewhere between dinner and dessert, my uncle, the one who had laughed loudest at Blythe's joke years earlier, asked me, without any prompting at all, whether I thought his own rental property downtown needed a more thorough maintenance schedule. I told him honestly that I didn't know his property well enough to say, but that I'd be glad to walk him through what a good record-keeping system looked like, if he wanted one. Blythe, sitting across the table, caught my eye for just a second. Neither of us said anything about it. Neither of us mentioned the last time this exact table had hosted a conversation about binders and boring paperwork. We didn't need to. The silence held its own kind of acknowledgement, quieter and more honest than an apology would have been. Anselm asked me recently, on an ordinary evening with no particular reason for the question. He wanted to know whether I ever regretted keeping the binder, all those years before anyone else understood why it mattered. I thought about it honestly before I answered him, because it deserved an honest answer, not just a comforting one. I told him no, and I meant it. Not because it eventually vindicated me, since I've already told you that vindication felt nothing like I expected it to feel, but because keeping it was never really about anyone else's opinion in the first place. It was about a promise, made at a kitchen table, to a woman who is no longer here to check whether I kept it. Some promises, I've come to believe, are worth keeping precisely because no one is watching. That, I think, is the truest thing this whole story has taught me, truer even than anything that happened during the storm itself. I think about Sabina almost every autumn now, on the specific afternoon each year when I climb down into the basement on Birchwood Avenue. Clipboard in hand, flashlight in the other, checking the same system she once checked with me, in the same unglamorous order she taught me decades ago. The furnace first. Then the water shutoff, then the smoke detectors, then the little brass tags that still, somehow, after all these years, remind me of her handwriting more than my own. I don't know if she ever imagined that habit would matter. Matter beyond keeping two tenants warm through an ordinary Fargo winter, I mean. I don't think that was ever the point for her, and I've stopped needing it to be the point for me either. Some winters, nothing happens at all, and the binder simply grows one more quiet entry, unremarkable, unread by anyone but me. Other winters, apparently, everything happens at once, and the binder is the only thing standing between an ordinary Tuesday and a tragedy nobody in my family would have recovered from cleanly. I keep it either way. I think that's the whole lesson, if a lesson this quiet can even be reduced to a single sentence. You keep it either way, and you let the winters decide, on their own schedule, whether anyone will ever need to know. Sabina never got to see how her lesson would eventually matter. I think that's true of most quiet lessons, the kind passed between people who love each other carefully. You rarely get to watch them land. You simply pass them on, quietly, without ceremony, and trust the person receiving them to carry them forward, long after you are no longer there to check on whether they actually did. If any part of this reached you, leave a comment describing the quiet, unglamorous work you do that nobody has properly thanked you for. Someone reading this, I promise, will recognize themselves in your answer, the same way I hope you recognized something of yourself in mine. Thank you, sincerely, for staying with me all the way through this one tonight. I will see you again very soon in the next story.